Captain Ilervez of the Andari Watch stood at the edge of the observation deck, watching the last star in her sector dim to black. It wasn't a supernova. It didn't collapse into a neutron core or a black hole. It simply stopped, as if the universe had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. She clenched her jaw. This was the third star this week. "Record entry," she said, her voice low. "System Kira 12. Host star terminated. No survivors detected on orbital habitats. No emergency pings received. Null interference confirmed." The ship's eye, a whispering presence named Luma, responded with static that almost sounded like a sigh. "Confirmed. You are now the last vessel in Sector 14. A pause. Again. Iler ignored the sting in her gut. She was used to that word now. Last. The galaxy was filled with too many lasts lately. Last message, last colony, last hope. The Null didn't announce themselves. They didn't conquer or negotiate. They just came. Systems would report anomalies, gravity glitches, static-laced visions, memories failing. Then everything would go dark. Planets left lifeless. Stars extinguished without warning. Even digital records turned to static. The only thing worse than death was forgetting a civilization had ever existed. And the Council? Useless. Stuck debating whether the Null were a weapon, a force of nature, or divine punishment. Meanwhile, ships like hers kept watching the lights go out, one by one. She turned away from the viewport and approached the console. The final message protocol was ready, encrypted, fragmented, laced with ancient tongues and non-linear math. It was a desperation play, cobbled together from the last scientists who hadn't vanished or gone mad. "Where will you send it?" Lumen asked, her voice trembling through the hull like a ghost trying to remember its name. "Everywhere," Iler said. "All bands, all directions. If anyone's left, if anything's left, they need to hear it." The console blinked green. The message was armed, designed to persist, designed to survive erasure. It contained warnings, yes, but more than that, it carried a seed, a conceptual weapon buried deep in metaphor and paradox. They tested it on null fragments with limited success, but it needed interpretation, something unpredictable, something alien to the galactic norm, something they'd never had time to find. Iler pressed her hand to the interface. The system recognized her biosignature, her memories, even her emotional state. The message would carry a piece of her, because information laced with meaning traveled better, hurt deeper. As the signal charged, Iler looked up one last time. No stars now, just a black sea. "I hope you hear this," she whispered, "whoever you are." The message fired, a ripple of defiance cast into a dying galaxy. Then she triggered the last command. The ship decompressed. Silence took her. But the message flew on. And far, far away, beyond the ignored spiral arm of a blue and green planet barely considered sentient, a lonely satellite caught a signal it wasn't supposed to understand. And Earth began to listen. The satellite was never meant to pick up anything special. Launched by a half-funded European space agency 20 years earlier, it had been repurposed more times than its engineers could count. Originally intended for weather tracking, it had since become a low-priority deep space signal monitor, just in case. The signal arrived at 2:37 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. At first, it registered as background radiation. Then, as a garbled mess of layered frequencies. Hidden beneath the static was an impossible combination. Ancient Sumerian glyphs nested inside quantum harmonics, interlaced with alien pulses that caused the satellite's eye to freeze mid-diagnosis. The system pinged Earth. No one at the European Space Monitoring Division was awake to see it. But 3 time zones over, in a basement office of Reykjavik University, Dr. Elisabeth Freja stared at her monitor, frowning at the sudden burst of nonsense scrolling across her screen. She hadn't slept. Again. Her life had once been promising. Published papers, a doctorate in comparative linguistics, job offers from top universities. Then she'd started chasing patterns no one else could see. Languages buried in noise, symbols in static. Her colleagues called it a mental break. Her funding disappeared. Now she taught part-time and ran this monitoring project as a glorified hobby. But this wasn't random. She leaned closer as the waveform repeated, jagged and beautiful. It wanted to be heard. Ely, a groggy voice called from behind her. Thomas, the grad student who worked the night shift with her, shuffled in with coffee and a mismatched pair of socks. "Please tell me we're not chasing ghosts again." "Not this time," she murmured, fingers already dancing across the keyboard. This is structured. Something intelligent. It's recursive. It folds back on itself. And look, there are linguistic anchors. Symbol chains. Thomas blinked, now fully awake. "Wait, that's Akkadian. And what is that base 6 numeric compression?" She nodded. "It's not just language, it's intent. Someone is trying to be understood by something unfamiliar. Something. Not them." They worked in silence for the next few hours, pouring every ounce of knowledge into decoding the first layer. The signal fought them, shifting slightly, mutating with every decryption attempt. It wasn't static. It was responding. By sunrise, they'd cracked less than 1%, but it was enough. A phrase appeared, etched into their screen in alien calligraphy, translated by raw intuition and linguistic pattern matching. Pattern devours memory. Meaning is the weapon. Elizabeth stared at it. Her heart pounded. "This isn't a message," she whispered. "It's a war cry." Thomas looked pale. "Should we report it?" "To who?" She replied bitterly. "They'll shut it down. Call it a glitch or a hoax." "No, we keep going." Outside, the Icelandic sky began to lighten. Snow fell quietly over the world that still slept, unaware that something old and terrifying had spoken for the first time in decades. And far above, orbiting silently in the cold black, the satellite hummed as the signal grew stronger. Earth was no longer alone, and it had just been chosen. By the third week, Elizabeth was dreaming in languages she'd never studied. Each time she closed her eyes, visions came. Geometric patterns falling apart mid-formation, voices speaking in broken chains of metaphor, and a persistent hum, like a choir trying to harmonize with a machine. The signal was no longer static. It was evolving. Thomas noticed it first, the way the waveform shifted slightly after each decryption attempt, like it was reacting, learning. On paper, it should have been impossible. It wasn't a two-way communication. They weren't sending anything back. And yet, the signal adapted to them. "It's like it wants us to understand," Thomas said, his voice shaky. "Or worse, it's depending on us." The third decryption layer unraveled just before midnight on a storm-lashed Friday. It wasn't a language anymore. It was math fused with emotion, logic woven into sensory metaphor. What they uncovered chilled them both. A record, a map, a warning. The signal didn't come from one species. It came from dozens. Each section was a desperate contribution from a different civilization, stitched together in a universal tapestry of fear. Their worlds had been consumed by something beyond war, beyond reason, an anti-idea, a force of subtraction. They called it the null. Where the null passed, stars stopped burning. Memories faded. History unraveled. No one could remember what had come before. The signal was a collective attempt to encode resistance into something the null couldn't delete. Unpredictable thought, emotion, chaos, meaning. But the core message wasn't just a warning. It was a blueprint. The null weren't invincible. They had a pattern, a hunger for systems, symmetry, structure. They could only process what they understood. Anything outside that frame confused them, slowed them, hurt them. What the civilizations lacked, the message said, was the ability to think irrationally, to imagine without constraint, to weaponize unpredictability. That's why the signal mutated itself with each interaction. It was searching for a species that could complete it. And it had found humanity. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, shaking. Her monitor glowed with alien glyphs and translated fragments, some so poetic they didn't feel real. They consumed our stories. Our children forgot us while they still breathed. We sang nonsense into the void, praying for a mad species to answer. Thomas whispered, This is insane. We're not even on the galactic radar. We're nothing to them." "Exactly," Elizabeth said, eyes wide. "We're unpredictable, illogical. We make up gods and fight wars over colors. We write music that doesn't follow structure. We're what they were looking for. But why didn't they just send it to us directly?" She hesitated, then pointed at the next string of translated code, now blinking slowly on her screen. "They would never listen. But you break rules." They stared at each other in silence. For the first time in human history, Earth wasn't just receiving a message. It was being entrusted with a weapon, not of metal, but of meaning. They called it Project Pandora, a name chosen half in jest, half in defiance. At first, no one in power wanted to listen. The official scientific community dismissed the decoded signal as an elaborate hoax. Intelligence agencies interrogated Elizabeth and Thomas for weeks. But the moment they presented the deeper layers of the message, when government servers began to glitch just by storing the files, everything changed. The project went dark overnight. A coalition was hastily formed behind closed doors. Scientists, engineers, linguists, and even philosophers pulled from across the globe, all sworn to secrecy. Pandora was classified as Earth's first attempt at an adaptive cognitive weapon. Only a handful of people truly understood what it was, and none of them slept well anymore. The weapon wasn't physical in the traditional sense. It wasn't designed to fire bullets or lasers. It wasn't even designed to destroy. It was meant to confuse, to infect the null with something they couldn't process. Narrative, imagination, contradiction. The core of Pandora would be an interface, a synthetic neural web linked directly to a living human brain. Not a user, a partner. The system needed emotions, irrational thoughts, unpredictable decisions. It needed a soul. The first trials were disastrous. Volunteers plugged into the system suffered everything from hallucinations to full psychological breaks. Some screamed about seeing time inside out. One man believed he had conversations with forgotten gods. Another described a place behind thought, where the null whispered lullabies. Out of 24 test subjects, only one survived the link, Elizabeth Frazier. The moment her mind touched Pandora, the system stabilized. The waveform harmonized. No seizures, no madness. Instead, it pulsed gently, like it was breathing with her. "I don't understand it," she said afterward, still pale but steady. "It's not just a machine. It's listening, reacting to me. Not my thoughts exactly. My story." The engineers wanted to optimize it. Strip out the emotional feedback. Add logic failsafes. Make it cleaner, safer. The system rejected all of it. Every improvement made Pandora inert. Only when they let the chaos flow, let the irrational in, did the weapon awaken. It responded to metaphor. It evolved when exposed to contradiction. It grew when Elizabeth told its stories. It terrified them. But the signal from the stars hadn't been wrong. Pandora was working. The pieces were falling into place. Then came the warning. An anomaly registered near Saturn's orbit. Faint, irregular, but unmistakably wrong. Thomas stood in the observation deck, looking at the distortion blooming near one of Saturn's moons, an oily shimmer where physics twisted like melting glass. "We didn't activate anything, did we?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth stared through the glass. She looked calm, too calm. "We didn't have to," she said. "They heard us thinking." And far out in the black, something old and formless began drifting toward Earth's light. Not as an army, not as an invasion. As a test, the Null had noticed. Pandora was no longer a project. It was Earth's only chance. The Null did not arrive with ships. They did not descend in fire or declare war. They simply appeared at the edge of Earth's solar system, curled like ink in water, a slow unraveling of logic and light. Observatories tried to track them, but lenses cracked. Satellites glitched. Even gravity began to behave oddly. Time near the anomaly no longer flowed cleanly. Deep space probes sent images of Saturn's rings spinning backwards. One camera caught its own destruction from 10 seconds before it happened. Every human sensor agreed on only one thing. Reality was bending. Pandora, now fully bonded to Elizabeth, felt the change before any machine could detect it. She woke up gasping, eyes wide, whispering fragments of a language that hadn't existed for 10,000 years. Symbols danced in her vision, some made of sound, others pure concept. The Null weren't approaching with weapons. They were the weapon. The cognitive erasure engine, unraveling cause and effect wherever they passed. I saw them, she whispered, shaking. But not them, not shades. Ideas, dying, folding inward. They're not alive the way we understand it. They're what's left when the story ends. Thomas, pale and frantic, ran the latest telemetry through Pandora's neural lattice. They're warping us from outside thought, he muttered. How do you even fight something like that? Elizabeth closed her eyes. With meaning, she whispered. They destroy patterns. We build them. And so, Earth prepared, not with fleets, but with art. All across the Pandora network, humanity's greatest minds uploaded music, poetry, quantum paradoxes, comedy routines, unsolvable riddles. Anything that defied pure logic, anything beautifully irrational. The system consumed it all and began to reshape itself. Pandora no longer looked like a machine. Its central interface became a shifting mosaic of symbols and memories, filtered through Elizabeth's mind. Flickering images of childhood laughter, collapsing stars, a mother's embrace, the smell of wet earth after rain. It felt human, deeply, terrifyingly human. And that was the point. When the Null touched Earth's orbit, reality groaned. Skies fractured like mirrors. Birds flew loops that never ended. People forgot the names of their children mid-sentence. Whole city blocks became echoes of themselves, repeating endlessly at slightly different angles. Then a single message appeared across every screen on Earth. Pattern breach detected. Unresolved error. Meaning. Thomas turned to Elizabeth. They're trying to parse us. She nodded slowly. Let's give them something to choke on. Pandora flared to life. The signal it emitted wasn't a beam or wave. It was a story. Spoken in no single language, told across every medium. Sound, image, paradox, irony, grief, joy, fear, rage. It cascaded into the approaching anomaly like ink exploding underwater. The Null halted. They did not understand. Worse, they couldn't. In their hunger for simplicity, they had never conceived of madness that made sense, of emotions that carried power, of a species that turned chaos into art and tragedy into fuel. Earth didn't resist with force. It resisted with meaning. And for the first time, the Null paused, not in victory, but in confusion. The Null did not scream. They simply recoiled, reality rippling as their fractal presence twisted away from Earth's orbit, folding in and out of perception like a corrupted thought trying to erase itself. Pandora pulsed harder than ever, glowing with raw data and human emotion. Inside its neural lattice, Elizabeth stood at the center of a dream that wasn't a dream. She floated among 1,000 fragmented memories, not all her own. She saw Hiroshima and jazz clubs, saw a child laughing while drawing monsters with crayons, saw the burning of the Library of Alexandria, and the launch of Voyager 1. She was no longer just herself. She was us, and the Null couldn't bear to look. Status. Thomas called, his voice sharp over the Pandora link. Elizabeth blinked, half inside the interface, half out. They're fragmenting. They don't understand us. Not just me, all of us. Our contradictions, our madness, our refusal to follow pattern. Outside, the sky flickered with impossible shades. Patterns of non-existence collapsed. The Null were trying to rewrite their own approach, adapt their method of erasure. But every change was met with another surge of chaos from Pandora. More signals were added to the mix, millions of them. People all over Earth had begun contributing without knowing it. Cell phones recorded spontaneous poetry. Children sang strange lullabies on playgrounds. An entire subreddit dedicated itself to writing stories that made no logical sense, and somehow every one of them was true in its own way. Humanity was feeding Pandora with its most powerful weapon, meaning born from madness. And the Null were choking on it. They tried to reassert order. Earth's digital systems began failing as the Null flooded the electromagnetic spectrum, trying to drown the signal. But for every byte erased, humans created 1,000 more. Every deleted poem gave birth to a protest song. Every corrupted memory sparked a new story. Thomas stared at the data flooding through. They're not used to resistance. Their whole existence is subtraction. They thought we were just another silence waiting to happen. But we're loud, Elizabeth said, voice steady now. We never shut up. We create, even when we're dying. That's what they didn't expect. And then Pandora shifted again. It began to respond, not just to the Null, but to Earth. It became a mirror of everything humanity had ever been and everything it might become. Hope, pain, love, fury. It twisted all of it into an impossible counter-pattern, a song that defied deletion. For the first time in recorded history, a force of pure entropy met something it could not consume. The Null tried to flee, but even retreat proved dangerous. Their unraveling form left scars across the void, areas of warped time, logic echoes, broken laws of causality. Yet as they pulled away, one thing became clear. Earth had not just survived. It had wounded the impossible, and Pandora whispered its final broadcast into the void. You taught us to fear silence, so we became noise. You tried to erase meaning, so we became the weapon you couldn't define. The Null were gone. Not destroyed, not defeated in the way ancient empires fell, but driven back, forced to retreat beyond the veil of understanding they once controlled. For a long, breathless moment, Earth stood in silence. Then space responded. Across the stars, long dormant arrays flared to life. Monuments carved into dead moons began to hum. On distant worlds thought long extinct, machines powered by forgotten languages pinged Earth's solar system with cautious pulses, probes of curiosity, of disbelief. Humanity had done the impossible. It had made the Null hesitate. Within hours, a flood of data began arriving, alien messages packed with dense quantum encryptions and cultural signatures that hadn't seen use in millennia. Civilizations once erased by the Null were stirring from hiding. Some were spectral shadows, preserved in backup memory systems. Others were true survivors, broken, scattered, half extinct, yet still clinging to some form of sentience. They all said the same thing. We saw your noise. We thought you were lost. You gave the silence a crack. Thomas stood in the Pandora command center, reading one translation after another, tears streaming down his cheeks. They were watching us, hoping, for centuries, maybe longer. Elizabeth, still tethered to Pandora, felt every incoming signal ripple through her like distant thunder. They weren't messages, not entirely. They were acknowledgments, recognition, reverence. Humanity, the species once laughed at for its primitive chaos, had become something else. Not a galactic empire, not a military power, but a myth, a legend in the making. In a quiet moment, Pandora projected a holographic memory over the room. It showed 1,000 alien cultures stitched together in a mosaic of stories. All had fallen before the null, except Earth, the last piece, the final variable. "We were the joke," Elizabeth whispered, "but we were wrong in just the right way." And now, the galaxy was listening. Leaders across Earth scrambled to adapt. The United Nations became irrelevant overnight as a new form of diplomacy emerged. Translation diplomacy. Every culture on Earth began mining its myths, arts, and philosophies, feeding them into Pandora, refining what made humanity's nonsense so dangerous. In less than a week, Earth became the focal point of a galaxy recovering from trauma. A small, chaotic world that once couldn't agree on what counted as a sandwich now held the only tool capable of keeping the null at bay. But it wasn't all triumph. A warning came hidden among the transmissions. "They are wounded, not destroyed. They will return. And next time, they will adapt." Elizabeth read those lines in silence. They weren't afraid, these alien survivors, but they were cautious. The null had never encountered true resistance before. Now they had a name for what threatened them: humanity. Thomas looked up. "So what happens now?" She smiled faintly, eyes glowing with fragments of stories not yet told. "Now," she said, "we teach the galaxy how to be loud." They called it the Resonance War, but it wasn't fought with guns or fleets. It was fought with stories. By the time the null returned, the galaxy had changed. Earth was no longer alone. Dozens of fractured civilizations had emerged from the shadows, rallying around the impossible truth. Humanity had cracked the code of entropy. And it had done so by refusing to make sense. Elizabeth stood once more at the core of Pandora, now rebuilt as something far more vast. It was no longer just a machine. It was a chorus fed by billions of voices. Every culture on Earth, from the smallest tribe to the largest city, had contributed. Songs, myths, memes, paradoxes, confessions, pain and wonder, grief and laughter. All of it pulsed through Pandora like blood through a god's veins. The null did not announce their return. They arrived. No ships, no warning, just the same quiet unraveling of space itself, a ripple of forgetting that began eating moons like rot. But this time, Pandora was ready. And it was no longer just Elizabeth standing at the edge of reason. She was joined by others, liaisons from resurrected civilizations, empaths, and chaos weavers, irrational tacticians trained in cognitive warfare. Together, they engaged the null not with violence, but with contradiction. When the null tried to erase cause, Earth responded with dream logic. When they collapsed identity, Pandora surged with roleplay, fiction layered upon fiction, until no truth could be found. When the null unleashed the silence, a field that devoured all known forms of sound, Earth replied with an orchestra of emotionally charged static. Songs about love lost in languages that had never been spoken, rhythms that didn't repeat, harmonies that made no musical sense, and yet stirred tears. The null wavered. They adapted faster this time. But so did Earth. Thomas, now commander of the Pandora Coalition, issued the final directive: open the deep vaults. Hidden within were the darkest, weirdest, most unfiltered pieces of human expression. Banned books, forbidden art, schizophrenic writings, hallucinogenic paintings, religious ravings blended with scientific theory. Madness not as failure, but as fuel. Pandora unleashed it all. And the galaxy sang with us. From the ruins of a forgotten gas giant, a species made of living sound harmonized with our chaos. From a world lost in perpetual paradox, sentient math equations joined the storm. Together, they struck the null with what they could not categorize. A scream of infinite color. A lullaby made of war. A joke with no punchline that still made the stars laugh. The null fractured. Not from pain. From meaning overload. They didn't die. They simply fled, folding backward through dimensions, desperate to escape the noise they could never contain. And as they vanished, for the first time in eons, the galaxy remembered itself. The stars sang again. Elizabeth stepped out of Pandora for the last time, her eyes filled with memories that didn't belong to her. And yet, somehow did. "Is it over?" Thomas asked, voice soft. She looked up at the night sky, now flickering with 1,000 new signals from reborn civilizations. "No," she said. "It's just the opening act."